Hi, folks. Today we're going to be talking about Chapter 22, Nutrition and Energy. I will go through some of these initial slides very, very quickly. They're here in the slide deck if you need them, in terms of anything you might need to or want to go back and study in more depth for perhaps like a class later on if you're taking your NCLEX or something like that. But our main focus today will be on things like the vitamins and some of the pathways that we're starting to understand. So how what we eat turns into energy from a chemical perspective. So before we get into that, we are going to talk a little bit about these initial portions of the chapter, which deal more on the nutritional side of things. Um, and again, remember that most of what we're talking about will be talked about in concepts as they relate to chemistry, the class of chemistry, not necessarily a nutrition class or something like that. So we have two different kinds of nutrients. They come in a micro and a macro form. So the macronutrients that we've already learned about would be things like the carbohydrates, the lipids, the proteins from what we ingest. Micronutrients will be things like vitamins and minerals. So in terms of chemistry, macronutrients would be those three large macromolecules that we've discussed in chapters 17, 18, and 19. Micronutrients are going to be more related to coenzymes and cofactors that we talked about in chapter 20 when we were dealing with enzymes. Obviously, also water and fiber are an essential part of nutrition um, for a human. Please keep in mind, though, in terms of nutrition, these are other requirements, not necessarily with a nutritional value to them, right? So when we talked about different carbohydrates, we talked about fiber in terms of its no quote unquote nutritional value, but it is essential for making sure that everything's working the way it should. Um, so this is data. Now remember that your textbook was written a couple years ago, so things do change slightly each year in terms of what the FDA specifically, kind of wants to see there. But we do have something called a reference daily intake, which would be kind of an idea of how much, right, for different types of people, whether you are pregnant, nursing, a very small child, kind of a toddler, or an adult, how much, right, of each component you would need. So the example we give here is with protein. Again, in terms of where we're going with this class, we're not going to really go into too much detail on, your daily intake values or any of that kind of stuff, nor are we going to really dig into a nutritional label or the new food pyramid, which is on a plate. Um, what we want to start getting through is understanding those macronutrients and where the energy is coming from a chemical standpoint, as well as the value that those micronutrients hold. So we talked about this in chapter 17, but carbohydrates are the main dietary source of energy. This is because the fact that is part of our as part of our diet. It's one of the easiest ones to break down. Right, they're ideal for energy source for most bodily functions. They provide useful material. So remember that not only does the food we ingest provide us with energy, but it also provides building blocks, right? So when we break down food, the carbon, the oxygens, the nitrogens, everything that we ate is now part of like the Lego building set that we can use to go build other things that our bodies need. Um, so please keep in mind, obviously, when we're talking about carbohydrates, we're talking about in terms of an energetic source. Um, Keep in mind that things that are going to be high energy will also come with calories. That's part of it. Those go hand in hand. Um, when we're talking about carbohydrates, we have two kinds, which would be the simple carbohydrates and the more complex carbohydrates. Typically, depending on who you talk to, most people will consider a simple carbohydrate to be either a monosaccharide or a disaccharide, um, since there is minimal digestion that needs to occur to get to the glucose base unit. Complex carbohydrates will be polysaccharides and oligosaccharides, things like starches, which would include amylose and amylopectin, as well as cellulose. Again, remember cellulose fiber, not going to be of a nutritious value, but as we can't digest it properly. However, the fiber is still required in a necessary part of our gastrointestinal tract. Lipids, again, typically kind of get a bad rap. However, again, they are very good concentrated sources of energy. When we're talking specifically about it, for the mass, the amount of energy that we get out of it is a very efficient way to do it. So for the mass of the energy of the lipid that is ingested, approximately 2 times more energy would be able to be taken from that than a carbohydrate of an equal mass. They're also really important as there are some vitamins in our body. Remember, some vitamins end up being what we call coenzymes or cofactors, and they are what help out, do regulation and allosteric uptake of enzymes. So fats are necessary because some of our vitamins are fat soluble, and therefore we need that as a way to help carry them through the body to get them where they need to be. We have essential fatty acids. So we talked about linoleic acid and things like that when we were in chapter 18. Remember that when we call something an essential fatty acid or an essential amino acid or something like that, that means that our body cannot produce it and that we need to gather it from our environment, so through ingestion. From a gastronomy type perspective, lipids give textures to food. They improve flavors, retain flavors better. This is why typically when you go to a restaurant, most people are shocked by the amount of butter that is in everything, but that's simply because it helps kind of with the mouthfeel and the flavor retention of food. Because they are more complex than like a carbohydrate, they take more to break down. They're digested more slowly. This means that you feel fuller for longer, and we call this like satiation. So you are sated and feel full and satisfied. So typically, right, we have triglycerides, right, and that will be what makes up about 95% of the diet, right, of our bodies. Oils will have a higher percentage of unsaturated fat than solid fats at room temperature. Again, remember that oils tend to have more degrees of unsaturation to them. So they're kinky, which means they can't lay as flat, which means there aren't as many intermolecular forces occurring, which means it would take less energy to break them up, causing them to be liquids at room temperature instead of solids. And by contrast, solid fats have higher levels of saturated fats in them, which means they lay flatter and can stack on each other more readily, and that this stacking causes a great increase in the number of intermolecular forces between the fats, causing a need for there to be more energy to break them up. This is kind of just like a breakdown so that you can see the differences of what types of fats are in foods that we see on a regular basis. Everything from something like an olive oil to like palm oil or beef fat, which we call tallow, coconut oil. Everyone loves coconut oil. A couple years ago, that was all the rage to be super healthy with. But just keep in mind that is a large portion of saturated fat in there. Especially when you compare it to something like chicken fat or beef fat. So it's just one of those things that, you take with a grain of salt. Again, though, there are, in coconut oil, we do have the ability to, look at the fact that there are some essential oils or essential fats in there as well. Again, we're not going to go into too much detail of this, but obviously the higher amount of fat you have in your diet has been linked to a higher lipid level in your blood, so that there is some kind of encouragement to not go crazy with it. Lastly, we have proteins, macronutrient, macromolecule, with that recommended daily intake. And this is really especially important with growing children, infants, persons who are pregnant, things like that. It's important because we need protein to do things like build new tissue. So when you're growing or going through wound healing or through gestation of a fetus or something like that, you need a lot of protein because you're building something. It is also a way to it's a building block needed for the maintenance and repair of cells. So again, if you are someone who is um, doing a lot of working out, weightlifting, body training, weight training, things like that, you require protein as well to build the muscles that you have broken down and continue to grow. So also crucial to things like production of enzymes, hormones, right? Basically all the regulators in our body. It is a supply of energy. It's on par with a carbohydrate in terms of energy. Really, what's important with protein is all the building blocks and everything we need for the production of new cells, new tissue, all that kind of stuff. We also have essential amino acids. So remember when we were in chapter 19, we were talking about amino acids. Most of the amino acids that our body can produce ourselves. However, there are a few that are essential, which means we need to get them from other sources. We give the word complete protein, quote unquote, to a protein where it contains all the essential amino acids in proportions that are needed by the body. So there are foods where the protein that we are ingesting also provides us with these essential amino acids as well. So meat is only one source of protein. Obviously, animal products is an easy source of protein, but we can also get protein from vegetable sources as well, vegetable and grain sources. So when we start talking about the micronutrients, these are the things that we really need, but just in significantly smaller amounts than things like um, carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins. So again, remember that vitamins, minerals, things like these are essential when we're talking about them as cofactors and coenzymes for regulation of enzymes in our body. Vitamins are organic compounds that can't be produced by the body. Um, they can be, but like not in the amounts that we need them to be. So we have to get them from other sources. Most vitamins are water soluble. So if you take like a multivitamin or something like that, um, any of the excess that your body cannot absorb at that one time or does not need will be flushed out of your system and excreted via your urine. So if you've ever taken like a multivitamin before, you may notice that like your urine the next day or later that day is bright yellow. That's actually a lot of the vitamin B in the multivitamin that you are excreting. 9 water soluble vitamins, right, act as these coenzymes that we need in our body. There are also highly fat soluble vitamins. These can be somewhat dangerous when taken as supplements and should be something that is done under medical surveillance. Unlike water soluble vitamins, that when you have too much of them or you ingest too much that your body can't absorb all at once or doesn't need, the extra can just be secreted. Fat soluble vitamins, we don't have a means by which to excrete those. So what ends up happening is any of the fat soluble vitamin that is in excess that we don't need at that time will be stored in fat. And so you can actually build up very large supplies in your body of these fat soluble vitamins. And this can have a toxic effect. So here is just a list of many of the water-soluble and fat-soluble vitamins, as well as sources for them, what we use them for, and what happens in when we don't have enough of those type things. So we talked about vitamins. There's also minerals. So typically minerals will be things like a lot of metals or other kind of just elemental minerals. Um, Again, it shouldn't be surprising to you. Things like iron, um, copper, calcium is an important one. Sodium is another important one, right? Magnesium. These are metals that we need and are often cofactors in enzymes, is the requirement for them. So again, here you can kind of see the amounts of each of these in terms of grams that our body needs. Shouldn't be shocking that calcium is the greatest since it makes up a good amount of our bones. And there we go on to phosphorus and potassium, so on and so forth, all the way to our trace minerals, which would be things like iron, manganese, copper, and iodine. And again, here's a list of dietary sources, functions, and deficiencies that come from these major and minor minerals. Okay, so now we can talk about kind of the energetics of the food that we've been talking about and these macromolecules that we've been learning about. So you are probably familiar with the concept of photosynthesis and how we have the sun, and then the sun will shine down on plants, and then the plants can use photosynthesis to convert light energy into chemical energy. Plants typically will do this and produce glucose, right, as well as oxygen. They absorb CO2, water, and energy from the sun. Photosynthesis occurs, and we produce glucose and oxygen. In a person or animal or anything like that, cellular respiration, right, would be glucose and other forms of stored energy plus oxygen. Through the process of breathing, respiration produces CO2, water, and release of energy. So, taking that glucose that came from the photosynthesis process, right? Glucose is a way to store energy that is then stored, and then through a cellular respiration process is broken down, and two of the byproducts would be CO2 and water, as well as the energy. So cellular respiration, in this case, when we're looking at it in this direction, would be an exothermic process. So here's just kind of a general, very big picture kind of thing, right? So we have the energy from the sun, nuclear fusion's going on here, right? But that radiates down to us here on Earth, and then plus some CO2 and water, and the energy from the sun, photosynthesis occurs, and we produce carbohydrates. So, eventually, really what we're getting at is glucoses. Then an animal can eat that plant, eat those carbohydrates, go through cellular respiration to produce energy for that plant as well as for amounts of H2O and CO2. Now, obviously, that CO2 can go back and be a part of this process, and we get a little circle of life Simba going on here. Now, in that animal, obviously, heat will be utilized not only to, as a process by which the animal needs to regulate its body temperature, but it's just kind of a part of the process. There's really that's kind of the dissipation of that energy in terms of the cycle there. But we also produce ATP. And this can do chemical work. So this would be things like the development of building an enzyme or anything like that, biosynthesis. Mechanical work, this would be how any of the movements of muscles or anything like that would work. And then osmotic work would be active transport. So how does, cortisol that's released in the brain, released through the body or anything like that. So atmospheric carbon can be cycled through a process of photosynthesis and cellular respiration. So over and over and over again, carbon can be kind of just cycled through this process through from plants to animals and then released again to be plants to animals and released again, so on and so forth. So a plant goes through the process of photosynthesis, producing carbohydrates. Those carbohydrates are eaten by an animal and through respiration is broken down and exhaled as CO2, right? So carbon there, and then that is then taken back up by another plant, so on and so forth. So when we say the word metabolism, what we're actually talking about is catabolism and anabolism. And so metabolism is both processes, but we're going to break these down. So catabolism, right, is going to be the reactions involved in the breaking down of biomolecules. And conversely, we can have the building of biomolecules. So metabolism is the breakdown and build, the breakdown and build, the breakdown and build kind of pathway. A metabolic pathway is the sequence of how this whole process would occur. So the catabolism of food, what we're talking about here is the three major steps that go into us eating and how that ends up being broken down into energy. So for example, in the first stage, right, this would be this actually eating. Large complex molecules are digested into simpler ones using hydrolysis reactions. So this would be you eating a burger, for instance. Now, obviously, there's carbohydrates and lipids in there as well. But let's just talk about the protein, right? So hydrolysis will start even in the beginning in our mouths as we begin to salivate. There's digestive enzymes in our spit. And that will help with this hydrolysis process even before it reaches our gut. And so proteins are broken down into amino acids, disaccharides, right, and polysaccharides, oligosaccharides. The bigger sugars get broken down into monosaccharides of glucose, and then fats and oils will be broken down into fatty acids and glycerols. So after that first stage of breaking down complex food into simpler ones, those simple molecules, right, those smaller molecules, are broken down even further into just very tiny, like little chunks of carbon and acetyl-CoA. And then lastly would be the common catabolic pathway, right, which is how we take those small units that were broken down in stage 2 and utilize those to produce ATP as a way to store energy. So here is ATP. But we have kind of like a simplified version of it here. So triphosphate, 1, 2, 3 for triphosphate. And then off of that, off of that phosphate will be a sugar backbone as well as adenine. So we have adenine and ribose together makes adenosine. So when we say ATP, we're talking about adenosine, which is this part. When it's TP, that would be 1, 2, 3 phosphates. So here's kind of that stage 1, 2, and 3 in a picture form. So here are complex foods that are eaten. They are broken down into simpler ones. All those simpler foods are further broken down into acetyl-CoA, which feeds into what we call the citric acid cycle, producing some CO2. There's electron transports that go on with this to produce ATP. ATP is a really good way to store energy, and that's because as we hydrolyze ATP, a lot of energy gets to be released. So the way I try to explain this to students is think of these phosphates as like Kit Kat bars, and each time we hydrolyze or break one of the Kit Kat bars off, we're going to release energy when we do that. And we can break off multiple at a time if we need to, and we build them back up. So here is an example of us releasing and breaking one of these phosphates off. When that bond breaks, that's where we have high amounts of energy released. So for example, ATP being hydrolyzed into ADP, D standing for di, so we only broke off one phosphate group. We can go from ATP and break off 2 phosphate groups, giving us AMP, which would be mono. These 2 phosphate groups here can be further broken down into 2 individual groups. And ADP could also be broken down into AMP as well. So you can see the large releases of energy that occur here. Going from ATP to AMP releases 10 kilocalories of energy per mole, but then in addition to that, you will get almost another, 5 kilocalories of energy when this double phosphate is broken down even further. So, the ATP to ADP cycle. So, how we're releasing, right, some amounts of phosphate. Um, Three different main sources we like to call it, but basically motion. So, this would be contractions of your muscles from everything you moving your eyeball to running a marathon to simply breathing. Active transport, this would be the transporting of blood through your system, a hormone through your body, anything like that. And then biosynthesis would be everything else, so the production of enzymes, production of hormones, um, any of that kind of stuff, growth, wound healing, all that. So, anyways, something is going to require energy to do that, so it's going to use up an ATP molecule when it does that, and in its place, it produces an ADP molecule. So, triphosphate work happens to diphosphate, and then diphosphate will then go through an oxidative fuel, right, and become triphosphate again. So, we can break the phosphates off through hydrolysis, and we can add them back on. So how does this occur, right? So ATP formation occurs in the inner membrane of the mitochondria. We're not going to go into too much detail here in terms of like cell structures and everything like that. But remember that, right, when we have like a human cell and things like that, they're going to start getting a little more complex than a single-celled organism. So we talked about coenzyme A, right? This is what all those foods are broken down and digested into. It's a central part of the metabolism process. We often will abbreviate it, right, for its part in acetyl-CoA. So coenzyme A is a part of acetyl-CoA. The CoA in acetyl-CoA stands for coenzyme A. It is derived from vitamin B. So when we have acetyl-CoA, what we are taking is vitamin B and digesting it and reworking it a little bit, where we end up with this thioester bond, right? And then from here, this can attach. And so acetyl-CoA is the primary fuel of the citric acid cycle, which is producing ATP. Now, there are a couple other important coenzymes along the way that we'll talk about in next chapters. Right now, I just kind of want to bring them up in a way where we can talk about them and identify them. The first would be nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide. And so this is, again, going to be a derivative of ADP and another vitamin, nicotinamide. So here's the vitamin. So we're going sugar, phosphate, right, backbone here. So here's our ADP, right, adenosine with the ribose is adenosine, and then diphosphate, and then here's the next one, right? So here is that vitamin up here. And what will happen is this can go through a reduction that will happen during the citric acid cycle. And so here's the NAD portion of it that, does the work. When it is reduced, this double bond is reduced and we produce this. So because this was aromatic in its design, when we reduce it, we're going to lose some of our aromaticity, but you still have this double bond here, so it's still going to be able to do some configurations, but for the most part, we end up with NADH, which is the reduced form of it. NAD plus is an important oxidizer of many biomolecules, right, as we have digestion and through the citric acid cycle. Here we're just showing you how we get that reduction to occur, the reduction of the NAD to NADH, but the oxidation of other materials. So here, NAD becoming NADH, right, if we have this alcohol here, we can oxidize it to the carbonyl, or in this case, that's an aldehyde, but yes. Another important coenzyme that we're going to have is FAD, flavin adenine dinucleotide. again derived from an ADP, but this time the vitamin is riboflavin. So here's the riboflavin vitamin. Here is our ADP down here. Oops, that's the same. Oh, there we go. Okay, so this goes through a similar process, right? So if FAD is going to help oxidize things, what we can do is show that FAD is an important process in saturating compounds. Here's an unsaturated compound. FAD can help be an instigator for saturation. And that will be the end of chapter 21. Chapter 22 will start picking up more with catabolic pathways for carbohydrates. Chapters 23 and 24 will hit some highlights, some basic topics in there as well, a lot of them dealing with the production of energy as well as just these common pathways that we will see.